Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about debates about regionalism in A-level politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of the specification this video covers, and some key 12 markers and 30 markers you can use this content to answer in the exam. From there, I'm going to start by having a look at the relationship between regionalism and globalisation, going then into the prospects for political regionalism and regional governance across the world. I'm then going to look at the impact of regionalism on state sovereignty. We looked in the previous video at the impact of the European Union on state sovereignty, but this one's going to look at more generally bringing in other regional organisations. Before looking at the realist and liberal perspectives on regionalism, which can be really useful, especially if you're pushing for an A star in your exam. Before finally looking at the extent to which regionalism addresses contemporary global issues, including poverty, human rights, and the environment. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an updating textbook on the global politics section of the Edexcel A Level Politics specification that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website in the first link in the description, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your politics A level, including updating textbooks and essay plans, really detailed essay plans covering every single part of the course, including global politics 30 marker plans and 12 marker plans, a place to sign up for tutoring if you're interested, and a place to sign up for some live revision webinars we're going to be doing before this year's exams to really help you prepare a few weeks before each exam. So let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of specification this video covers. So this is the fifth of 5 videos on the channel on the 5th subtopic of the global politics Edexcel specification. That's the regionalism and the EU. We've done 2 videos on the European Union, looking at its significance as a global actor, but before that, the development, history of the European Union, its key institutions and its key aims. We've done 1 video on regional organisations excluding the European Union, looking at NAFTA, ASEAN, the African Union and the Arab League. And then there was an initial first video just giving an introduction to regions and kind of its political, security and economic regions. So this is the final video that brings together a lot of this content, so make sure to look at those first, and looks at some other key debates you get asked about in the exam. And that brings me on to the 12 markers and 30 markers. All the questions in bold, both for the 12 markers and the 30 markers, can be purchased on the Politics Explained website. They're detailed plans for them, whether 12 marker plans or essay plans. And if you know these questions in bold really, really well, and make detailed plans for them, whether you buy the ones on the website or make them yourself, you should be really well prepared for the exam, not just to answer some of these key questions that could come up, but also to adapt the content you know from those to answer different questions as well. This video is going to be really useful for a lot of these 12 markers in terms of some debates, looking at African Union, European Union, ASEAN and the European Union, kind of comparing these key institutions. A lot of the 12 markers has been covered, the content of the 12 markers have been covered in the previous videos though, but it's going to be really useful especially for these 30 markers. So this question here, evaluate the view that regional organisations have been effective in reducing conflict, poverty and promoting human rights. That's the final part of the video. We're going to look at its kind of effectiveness in addressing the effectiveness of regional organisations in addressing contemporary global issues, whilst this is also going to be really useful for example for looking at the impact of regional organisations on state sovereignty, which could be a key question you could get asked, and some of the content in this video is also going to be really useful for pretty much any 30 marker you can get asked about in the exam. Let's start off then by looking at the relationship between regionalism and globalisation. So regionalism and globalisation are 2 major forces shaping global economy and global politics that have really come to the fore in the last 30 years in particular, both more important now than they've ever been in history, and the relationship between is ultimately really complex. On the one hand, regionalism often complements globalisation by fostering trade networks and facilitating international cooperation, kind of really furthering the benefit of, or the kind of aims of globalisation in terms of promoting free trade and reducing trade barriers. But on the other hand, it can also serve as a counterbalance, allowing regions to protect their interests against the pressures and volatilities of global markets. So it can kind of act in 2 ways. We'll look first at how it can be seen as complementing globalisation, and that's first through reinforcing global trade networks. So it often complements globalisation by expanding global trade. So regional blocs reduce trade barriers among member countries, facilitating the free flow of goods, services and investments across borders. This can stimulate trade not only within the bloc, but also with external countries, contributing to global trade growth. For example, the EU single market has enabled its members to operate competitively on the global stage, with companies benefiting from a large borderless market and collectively negotiating trade deals that improve access to non-EU markets and reduce trade barriers with those non-EU markets. And if there wasn't a EU bringing together 27 smaller member states, it's unlikely that all of those would have signed trade deals with some of these most important economic partners. Therefore, overall, it can be seen as reducing trade barriers globally. It also helps to align policies across member states, making trade more efficient, for example, in regulation and customs practices. Regional blocs, as I mentioned, often also pursue trade agreements that extend beyond their borders, actively promoting global trade by acting as unified entities that can negotiate large-scale trade deals that smaller nations wouldn't have been able to secure independently. For example, the EU-South Korea Free Trade Agreement has significantly boosted trade between the European Union and South Korea, increasing EU exports by 76% since its implementation. Similarly, ASEAN has established free trade agreements with key global economies, including China, Japan, and India, demonstrating how regionalism can foster connections beyond the region itself, particularly for the small countries involved in the regional organisations. On the other hand, though, it's really important to recognise that regionalism can be seen as a kind of counter and a protection against the potential harsher effects of globalisation. So under free trade and globalisation, smaller and developing countries often find themselves at a disadvantage as they lack the economic kind of scale and political influence to negotiate favourable terms, particularly with bigger states like the United States and China. And this can lead to marginalisation, leaving these countries vulnerable to exploitation by larger economies that really dictate global rules of trade and investment. Smaller African nations, for example, often struggle to secure favourable trade terms with major economies like the United States and the EU have exploited them for their raw materials for decades, as their individual markets are relatively small and lack bargaining power. But regional organisations kind of address this imbalance by bringing smaller countries together as a bloc, who together, their economy as a whole is much greater, and that gives them much better bargaining power on the international stage to negotiate much more favourable trade agreements. So in that regard, it can be seen as protecting against globalisation and the potential risks of globalisation. And this is especially vital, this protective function, in the context of intensifying US-China competition that is increasingly defining global politics today. As the two superpowers are really vying for global economic dominance and competing, smaller countries really risk being drawn into the sphere of influence of one or the other, which compromises their own economic and political interests, because ultimately it's in both their economic interests to negotiate with both and do effective trade with both countries. And regional organisations like the EU and ASEAN give a platform for member states to engage with both the US and China, whilst avoiding over-reliance on either of them, and therefore being caught up in the global competition. For example, ASEAN has maintained strategic trade partnerships with both the US and China, but also strengthened ties with other Asia-Pacific economies. Whilst the EU has taken steps to safeguard its technology and manufacturing sectors from Chinese and American dominance by imposing tariffs and regulatory standards that almost certainly wouldn't have been done by individual member states within the European Union, because they have a lot less power and would have a lot more to lose from that. Finally, there are some criticisms of regionalism as a threat to globalisation. So critics argue that it undermines globalisation and global interdependence by creating insular blocs that focus on regional rather than global cooperation and really look after only their own interests. So nations can prioritise regional ties at the expense of kind of wider global engagement and negotiating trade and having trade relationships across the world. And then policies can actually be seen as protectionist. So regional organisations might eliminate tariffs within the bloc between all of the countries, but can put higher tariffs on external countries, which can increase tariffs overall and therefore harm global trade. For example, the EU has been criticised for being what's known as Fortress Europe, by creating a really extensive internal market that makes it harder for other countries to access EU markets. And crucial to this has been the agricultural policy, which has been criticised for providing subsidies to EU farmers, which lowers prices and disadvantages farmers from Africa in particular, and have really been damaged in their exports by that. So some really criticise actually regionalism as a threat to globalisation. Similarly, as regional organisations establish internal standards and protections, they may inadvertently create barriers for global businesses that can't meet the specific requirements for each regional market. For instance, the EU's strict environmental and consumer safety standards may make it challenging for companies from non-EU countries to compete in Europe. And this is sometimes referred to as the Brussels effect, where global companies are kind of forced to comply with EU laws, even if they're not within the EU. So yeah, on the one hand, it can be seen as a benefit for benefiting globalisation and free trade, as they often negotiate a lot of free trade agreements, and of course, often have free trade areas within the regional organisations. They can also be seen as protectionist by pursuing free trade within the country, but also then disadvantaging other countries in their ability to export into the European Union or ASEAN, for example. Next topic we're going to have a look at is prospects for political regionalism and regional governance. So economic regionalism has always been the primary driver of regional organisations. However, political regionalism is becoming increasingly important, and countries seek to pool their sovereignty to have a greater voice on the global stage and respond to shared challenges. And crucial to understanding this is understanding the difference between intergovernmentalism and supranationalism. And this is the central debate within political regionalism, which is the extent to which there's political integration between member states in a regional organisation. So intergovernmentalism is where member states retain full national sovereignty. So every decision is made by consensus, and that means that within a regional organisation, if it's intergovernmental, if one state vetoes a decision, it doesn't happen. Whereas supranationalism is where some decision-making power is transferred by member states to a central body that makes that final decision. So even if a nation state may oppose it, they may be forced to implement the decision because they've ceded that power to make the decision to a higher body, such as the European Central Bank, for example. Most regional organisations, including ASEAN, the Arab League, and the African Union, are intergovernmental institutions where decisions require consensus and member states require full sovereignty. This facilitates cooperation and regional cooperation without eroding national autonomy. They can also result in gridlock and slow decision making. In contrast, the European Union, as we've looked at in previous videos, has taken a supranational approach in several areas, particularly in economic policy. And that allows it to make binding decisions, which can enable a kind of more collective strategic policy. But it's also sparked debates over sovereignty, as it, of course, compromises member state sovereignty to a much greater extent than intergovernmental regional organisations. While other regions may not be inclined to adopt a fully supranational model, there is a potential for a hybrid approach where certain issues could be managed through partially centralised supranational institutions that allow for far more coordinated action. So what we're going to have a look at, and this is one of the key things on the specification, is how likely is it that the European Union, but also more importantly, these other regional organisations will pursue more supranational approaches, cede more national sovereignty to the regional organisation, which can make the decision in the future and therefore move closer to the model that the European Union has. So we're going to look at them in turn. The answer largely, as you'll see, is pretty much there's a few prospects at the moment, it looks like. The African Union, then, is the most developed and integrated regional organisation apart from the EU, politically at least, not economically, with significant cooperation on peace, security and socio-economic integration. Crucially, key to this is the Peace and Security Council, which addresses conflicts and supports peacekeeping missions in regions affected by instability, such as Somalia and the Sahel. Whilst the African Continental Free Trade Area has also been launched, which will pave the way for closer economic and political ties as member states kind of coordinate policies to facilitate trade. However, further political integration and move towards supranationalism face big challenges due to the diversity of political systems within Africa and within the African Union, and different levels of development among member states, as well as strong national sovereignty sentiments and concerns. So while the African Union shows potential for increased coordination and integration on security and economic issues, a shift to supranationalism arguably remains unlikely in the near future, with most member states favouring intergovernmentalism and retaining full national sovereignty. The European Union, as I mentioned, is the world's most advanced example of political regionalism, with substantial supranational structures already in place through the European Central Bank, European Commission, the European Court of Justice as well. And through these institutions, member states have transferred significant legislative, regulatory and judicial powers to centralised authority. And the EU does have a commitment to ever closer union, which was mentioned in its original Treaty of Rome and repeated in the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. And that reflects an ongoing push for deeper integration, although recent events like Brexit have sparked debate on the limits of this ambition. And while there's still potential for further political integration in areas like foreign policy and defence, and some key political figures like Olaf Scholz and Macron support this, for example, calling for an EU army, other member states have shown real reluctance to cede more national sovereignty, and across all member states there's relatively strong kind of populist Eurosceptic movements that would potentially prevent national governments from pursuing this aim. There's also, in the last 10, 15 years, you've seen increasing tensions within the EU over issues like migration, democracy, and economic policy, with the organisation overall struggling with having such economically and politically diverse member states. So whilst there is this commitment within EU treaties towards ever greater union and ever greater moves towards supranationalism, and this idea of EU government was, especially if you go back to the 80s in particular, there was this idea and real intellectual support from certain areas for effectively becoming a European government and a federalized system similar to the United States. In the last couple of decades, you've really seen support for that, especially since the financial crisis actually really decreased. And though it remains committed to its supranational framework and will still remain the most integrated and most supranational regional organisation, it does seem unlikely that in the future you'll have moves to even closer union and federalism. It just doesn't, federalisation really doesn't look likely. The Arab League and ASEAN arguably have a very similar story to the African Union. The Arab League has long struggled with limited political integration, operating primarily as an intergovernmental body for a dialogue and cooperation rather than binding policy decisions on its member states. Efforts to develop a unified stance on Palestinian statehood more recently have faced challenges due to differing national interests, particularly with the Abraham Accords. And although there's periodic momentum for enhanced political cooperation, the Arab League is very unlikely to move towards a supranational body, as it's always been since 1994 when it's founded. It's always prioritised national sovereignty, and I think there's not enough similarities between its member states, particularly if you look at Saudi Arabia, which has deep oil interests, very different to a lot of the other economies within the Arab League. I think it seems very unlikely they'll move to a supranational approach. The same, I think, can be said of ASEAN. It's always operating on a very strong intergovernmental basis with a core principle of not interfering in the internal affairs of member states, and that's really limited the extent of political integration. I think it seems very unlikely that ASEAN will pursue further political integration and supranationalism, as states won't want to give up their veto in relation to key issues, including, for example, in US-China competition, with Southeast Asia being a really important region in that regard. So overall, I think it looks unlikely you're going to have. There have been, of course, significant moves to, especially economic regionalism. There's very strong. There will be very strong continued integration economically, and the African Union in particular is likely to integrate more and more economically, particularly with its free trade area. However, I think politically across all four key regional organisations, the prospects for political regionalism are much less strong. Okay, what we're going to have a look at now is the impact of regionalism on state sovereignty, which we looked at very specifically in the previous video on the European Union. We're going to have a look at it more generally now on regional organisations as a whole, as I think this question could definitely be asked in the exam. And we're going to start with arguments that regionalism does undermine state sovereignty, with the first one being that supranational institutions mean that decisions can be imposed on a country even if they oppose them. So in regional organisations with supranational elements, which are crucially only the European Union and African Union, there are institutions like the European Commission, European Court of Justice, which hold significant power to enforce regional policies and legal rulings across member states. And that really does limit national sovereignty, as states can be forced to implement decisions made by these supranational European institutions. And the same can be said of the Peace and Security Council within the African Union, which has occasionally deployed peacekeeping forces in conflict zones, even in cases where the affected state has shown reluctance. That's the only part of the African Union that can be seen as supranational. So in Sudan, peacekeeping forces were deployed in the Darfur region to contain the violence despite resistance from the Sudanese government. So it overruled those national sovereignty concerns by the Sudanese government, as it was seen effectively regional stability was prioritised to try and prevent the conflict continuing to spill over into other countries. And it's exactly the same in the African Union's mission in Somalia, which was ultimately relatively successful. So although the African Union operates primarily as an intergovernmental body, its ability to impose security measures highlights how regional organisations can limit EU member states' control over domestic affairs in the interests of regional stability. The second key argument is that economic integration creates dependency, and economic agreements serve the whole bloc rather than the particular interests of a state. And this applies for intergovernmental regional organisations as well as supranational ones. So economic integration often creates dependencies as states become reliant on the regional market and economic policies that are designed to benefit the bloc as a whole. So decisions made, for example, if you're negotiating a trade deal with a different country, decisions on certain tariffs for certain sectors are made with the whole bloc in mind rather than just your country. So it may be that a particular decision made isn't kind of specifically designed for a country, and that can be seen as limiting their sovereignty over economic policy. And they may be forced to accept that, because if you're negotiating as a regional bloc, not everything's going to be directly in your interests. So that shows that intergovernmental institutions can reduce some of that national control in some areas, of course. In the EU, it's even stronger, of course, because you have supranational economic institutions like the European Central Bank, which decides monetary policy for 20 countries that are in the Eurozone. So that's a real demonstration that economically national sovereignty has been ceded. But of course, it's also in these other regional organisations. In the African Union, smaller economies may struggle to compete with dominant players such as Nigeria, South Africa and Kenya. And these larger economies may have more influence over the decisions that are made in relation to trade policies, for example. In ASEAN, economic agreements such as the ASEAN Free Trade Area facilitate the reductions of tariffs and barriers within the bloc, but also create dependency among member states on regional trade rather than creating diversified economies, potentially, is an argument you can make. And countries like Myanmar and Laos with smaller, less competitive economies may find themselves at a disadvantage within the ASEAN Free Trade Area in a similar sense to which maybe Southern European countries struggle to compete with Germany and France within the European Union. Final key argument that regional organisations do erode state sovereignty is that they can erode countries' cultural and political identity, as countries adapt to shared norms and standards that may not align with their unique values and traditions. And I think the EU is the real main one for this, where member states must comply with common policies on issues like immigration, human rights and social welfare, because they're supranationally, often decided by supranational institutions, which may conflict with local customs or political preferences. So Hungary and Poland have resisted EU mandates on migration and judicial reforms, arguing that they clash with their national values, but because they're made by supranational institutions with qualified majority voting, even though they voted against, for example, forced migration quotas, they've been forced to accept them, and that could be potentially seen as against their cultural and political identity. On the other hand, we're going to look at now some arguments that regionalism doesn't undermine state sovereignty. The first key argument is that other than the EU, regional organisations are pretty much all intergovernmental, or primarily intergovernmental in the case of the African Union. And this means that member states retain a high degree of autonomy and control over decision making, as the decision making is based on consensus, which means that if one state vetoes a decision, that decision isn't implemented. So in ASEAN, decision making is based on consensus and the core principle of non-interference in each country's internal affairs, meaning that no policy can be implemented unless all member states agree. This allows countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines and Thailand to engage in regional cooperation whilst retaining full control over policies that affect their sovereignty. It's exactly the same in the Arab League, where member states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia can pursue their foreign policies independently, even when they differ from other Arab League countries, such as during the Gulf states' diplomatic shift towards Israel. So there's no binding decisions on member states, and they really retain their full sovereignty and can decide their own foreign policies, for example. The African Union also adheres to an intergovernmental framework where member states retain decision-making power, where, for example, cooperation in peacekeeping operations is voluntary and reflects the individual country's willingness to engage. Crucially, states retain complete sovereignty over key policy areas. So even within highly integrated regional organisations like the EU, which are more supranational, member states retain complete control over core areas of national interest, such as taxation, defence and foreign relations. EU member states maintain independent defence forces and make sovereign decisions on military matters, with NATO actually being the key defence alliance for Europe rather than the EU itself. It can be seen in other organisations as well. In the African Union member states retain complete authority over their defence policies. The Arab League is exactly the same, where member states maintain separate foreign policies and alliances. For example, Qatar and Saudi Arabia pursue very distinct diplomatic agendas, as demonstrated by the recent Gulf blockade, where Qatar maintained relations with Iran despite pressure from other Arab states, and therefore distancing itself and having a very different foreign policy in comparison to other members of the Arab League. ASEAN also operates under a non-interference policy that allows countries to independently manage foreign relations and defence, which is crucial given the diversity of political and security alliances. Thailand, for example, has strong military cooperation with the United States, whilst Cambodia has stronger ties with China. Another key argument that regionalism doesn't undermine national sovereignty is that it actually enhances states' overall influence on the international stage. Joining a regional bloc for smaller member states in particular can strengthen their bargaining power with larger economies and give them a seat at the table in international discussions. So in the African Union, member states collectively address issues such as climate change and trade, and could present kind of a united front on behalf of the continent of Africa to negotiate, to present kind of a collective voice, and negotiate with powerful countries like China and the United States. So during negotiations on climate policy, the AU has advocated for increased climate funding for Africa, for example, a stance that benefits all of their member states. Similarly, ASEAN has used its collective influence to play a central role in diplomacy, particularly in trade and regional security. And this shows that regionalism can amplify the global influence of individual states, allowing them kind of to leverage collective power. So rather than actually losing power and control, which kind of the idea of it compromising national sovereignty suggests, they're actually increasing their overall power, control, and influence. And the final really important argument is that states can just leave regional organisations if you want to, as demonstrated by Brexit. Yes, countries may give up some national sovereignty when they enter a regional organisation, but they retain the ability to remove themselves from that regional organisation and regain their full national sovereignty. So ASEAN and the African Union are exactly the same, don't impose binding membership. And the flexibility to withdraw reinforces the sovereignty of each state. And membership is fluid in the Arab League, with instances of countries temporarily suspending or adjusting their participation based on political disagreements, as was the case with Egypt's temporary suspension following its peace treaty with Israel in 1979. Just simply reinforces the idea that regionalism is voluntary and member states can regain complete control over their engagement, complete control over their economies and national decision making by leaving an organisation, as the UK did with Brexit. Before looking at the relationship between regionalism and contemporary global issues, as we've kind of done with we looked at contemporary global issues for every subtopic so far, we're going to look at the realist and liberal perspectives on regionalism. And you don't necessarily need to bring these into your essays, but it can be a really good way to, if you're really pushing for an A-star. So then, what's the realist perspective on regionalism? Realists ultimately view regionalism as a strategic tool for states to safeguard their security within a competitive international system. So for realists, states join regional organisations to bolster their own power against external threats, rather than kind of with the ideals of integrating politically in ways that would compromise their autonomy, because realists also always emphasise that states are the most important, nations are the most important actor in global politics and are always motivated by protecting and maximising their own power. So therefore, for realists, regionalism is only valuable to a state if it strengthens their sovereignty, allowing members to collaborate on shared interests and have greater influence overall. Realists ultimately argue that regionalism is fundamentally intergovernmental, as states are unlikely to cede significant sovereignty. In this view, regionalism is primarily a pragmatic tool for power consolidation by states, as it's unlikely to lead to deep political integrations. They argue it's very rare that it's going to be in countries' interest to integrate deeper and deeper, and that's not going to be particularly successful. Liberals, on the other hand, see regionalism as a real positive force that can enhance sovereignty through cooperation and mutual defence. From a liberal perspective, regional organisations create stable frameworks that encourage states to share sovereignty in specific areas, believing that this cooperation strengthens national security, prosperity, and their overall kind of influence. So they kind of point to the idea of pooled sovereignty that we looked at in the previous point. The EU is really viewed by liberals as an example of how pooling sovereignty can produce collective benefits that outweigh individual compromises. By fostering interdependence, they're less likely to go to war as well, but they also, by kind of really cooperating, have a greater influence on the global stage. The final thing we're going to have a look at then is the extent to which regionalism addresses contemporary global issues, looking at conflict, human rights, the environment, and reducing poverty. So starting off with conflict, on the one hand, it could be argued that regionalism is effective in reducing conflict by building trust among member states and creating economic interdependence and trade that discourages conflict through mechanisms for mediation and collective security. So by kind of working together and creating mechanisms to address regional conflicts, the African Union, through the Peace and Security Council, has been really effective in reducing regional conflict and bringing some stability to regional conflicts, where it's had successful peacekeeping missions in conflict zones such as Somalia and the Sahel. Similarly, the EU has been really effective in maintaining peace among its member states, which is really one of the founding aims, create interdependence between France and Germany especially, and there's less likely to be war within Europe. And there hasn't been a war among EU member states since World War II. And in Southeast Asia, ASEAN provides a platform for dialogue and confidence building, particularly around contentious issues. And by providing that dialogue through a regional organisation, things are more likely to be resolved diplomatically rather than leading to escalation and conflict. On the other hand, it can be argued that regionalism is ineffective in reducing conflict. Not all regional organisations have succeeded in reducing conflict, and some struggle to enforce collective decisions due to internal divisions or lack of political will. The Arab League have faced significant challenges in resolving conflict amongst its members, has ultimately been really unsuccessful. So in the Syrian civil war, for example, it initially responded by suspending Syria's membership, but these measures did very little to stop the war or do anything really, as the League was unable to facilitate a resolution or provide a unified response to the crisis, largely due to different stances among its member states, with Qatar's support for Syrian opposition groups, for example, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, versus Egypt and Algeria, which had more neutral approaches. Those divisions prevented it acting as an effective kind of mediation force within the Middle East. And that shows that while regionalism has the potential to mitigate conflicts, its effectiveness really depends on member states' willingness to prioritise collective stability over their individual interests and alliances. And realists would argue they would almost never do so. In terms of human rights then, so first you have an argument that regionalism is effective in promoting human rights, and that's by establishing monitoring mechanisms and encouraging member states to uphold certain minimum human rights protections. And if that's coupled with the threat of being kicked out of a regional organisation if you don't uphold human rights, that can really have an impact, because countries want to maintain their economic benefits of being a member state within a regional organisation. The African Union has adopted the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is a legally binding document that sets out a framework for human rights, and it's established the Court on Human and People's Rights, which allows individuals and organisations to bring cases against member states. Similarly, the European Union has embedded human rights within its legal framework and made it a real criteria for EU membership. So member states, if they want to be member states, have to respect the rule of law. They have to be democracies, and they have to respect human rights. And because EU membership is potentially so transformative for a country in terms of economic growth, that's led to a lot of countries in Europe really improving their human rights records in order to become EU member states. On the other hand, though, there's arguments that regionalism is ineffective in promoting human rights, as they often face internal divisions and the lack of enforcement mechanisms necessary to hold member states accountable, and that's particularly for these intergovernmental institutions. So while the Arab League has made statements condemning human rights abuses in conflict zones such as Syria and Yemen, it lacks a binding human rights charter and limits its ability to take concrete action. So it might have a lot of dialogue and a lot of rhetoric, but does it actually have an impact? Potentially no. Similarly, the AU has been criticised for its limited effectiveness in cases involving powerful member states. So despite concerns over human rights abuses in Ethiopia and Sudan, for example, it's not intervened decisively due to political sensitivities and the need to maintain regional unity. And ASEAN is exactly the same. The organisation's principle of non-interference really importantly limits its capacity to address human rights violations within member states like Myanmar, where recent actions against the Rohingya have drawn international condemnation, but no kind of peacekeeping force or little action by ASEAN to effectively prevent that kind of Rohingya genocide continuing. So they may be able to create, regional organisations may be able to create frameworks for human rights, but their impact often depends on member states' willingness to prioritise human rights over national sovereignty and political alliances, which they often don't. The next key global challenge then is reducing poverty. On the one hand, regional organisations can be seen as really effective in reducing poverty by fostering economic cooperation, facilitating trade, and providing funding to kind of targeting less developed member states to improve their rates of poverty or decrease their rates of poverty. So the AU has made poverty reduction a core priority through kind of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which promotes stable economic growth and improving infrastructure. And according to the World Bank, the free trade area, the African continent of free trade, also has the potential to really reduce poverty and lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty by 2035 as a result of the economic growth it could potentially generate. Similarly, the EU has significantly reduced poverty within its member states, not only through the economic benefits it's brought through the single market, but also through kind of targeted structural and cohesion funds, which has given funding to less developed countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, allocating 367 billion euros to reduce regional disparities between 2014 and 2020. And in Southeast Asia, ASEAN's economic community has fostered economic integration and investment, with poverty rates in ASEAN countries such as Cambodia dropping from 47.8% in 2007 to 16.6% in 2021, drawn largely due to the ASEAN kind of free trade area and increase economic growth and regional investment and job opportunities as a result. On the other hand, it can be argued that it's ineffective in reducing poverty, as economic integration can lead to uneven development benefits, uneven development, and really benefit wealthier states more than poorer states. So, for example, that's largely due to the fact that if you have an open market where all states can compete effectively, the countries with the already more developed sectors, so for example manufacturing sectors and greater power, are more likely to be successful within that internal market. For example, Germany's benefited hugely from the European Union, where you can argue that southern European states such as Greece, Spain, and Italy haven't benefited as much because they haven't been able to compete with northern European states such as Germany and France, for example. That was also really demonstrated after the 2008 financial crisis, where you saw kind of unemployment really rising in a lot of these southern European states, and actually austerity measures being forced by the kind of supranational European Central Bank on Greece because of the risk that it posed to the euro. Further, African Union really struggles, has had struggles in reducing poverty, partly due to limited infrastructure. For instance, only 70% of Africa's roads are paved, which really restricts the potential impact and benefits of the African continental free trade area, because that limited transportation really limits, kind of harms the potential for growth in trade. Also, ASEAN also has challenges in kind of real discrepancies between its countries. So Singapore's GDP per capita is $60,000 now in 2022, nearly $6,000 in 2022. Whilst other member states really significantly lag behind, and that shows the disparities in the benefits of regionalism to different member states. Finally, then, looking at the environment. So on the one hand, regionalism can be seen as being really effective in tackling climate change by kind of through collaboration on environmental standards and coordinated policies. The EU is a really leading example of this, making really ambitious commitments through the European Green New Deal, which aims to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. So it's set a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels, and its emissions trading system is the world's largest carbon market, has been really important in reducing carbon emissions by heavy industry. The EU's also allocated over $1 trillion in sustainable investments to support its goal to reach net zero. The African Union's also promoted initiatives such as the African Renewable Energy Initiative, seeking to provide real renewable energy, 300 gigawatts of it by 2030. Whilst both ASEAN and the African Union have also promoted the kind of climate financing and climate support from developed nations to developing states through their role in international organisations. However, regionalism is also not always effective in tackling climate change due to internal divisions. So countries with high reliance on fossil fuels within the EU have resisted ambitious emissions targets. Poland, for example, has frequently opposed emissions targets due to its dependence on coal, which accounts for approximately 70% of its electricity production. Further, while the African Renewable Energy Initiative and similar programs are promising, limited infrastructure and funding often prevent effective implementation. So only 48% of Africa's population has access to electricity, and climate financing for the continent remains far below what's needed to meet adaptation and mitigation goals, which is actually something the African Union has been saying on the global stage to developed nations. Whilst within ASEAN, you've also had real divergences in economic priorities and development levels, which has limited the ability of countries of different countries to pursue net zero. For example, richer countries better able to reduce their emissions due to their less dependent on kind of fossil fuel intensive industries. Hopefully that video was quite useful. That was a lot of information, so definitely chunk it into different parts when you're looking through it for your revision. That was the final video on the channel on regionalism and the EU, and that means we've done 22 videos on global politics on the channel now. There will just be 3 more videos coming out very soon on realism and liberalism. So they're kind of comparative theories, which are subtopic 6. Let me know if you've got any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you, and I'll see you in the next video.